On the coldest nights in Montana, when the snow falls sideways and the trees groan under the weight of winter, some cries go unheard. But not this time. Deep beneath a canopy of pine trees, a sound rose above the wind feint, desperate, the last thread of hope in a world turned white. What Walter Briggs discovered in the heart of that blizzard would not only change the fate of a forgotten family, but would thaw a sorrow that had frozen in his heart for nearly 15 years. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you listening from? Drop your city or state in the comments, and let's begin this story of survival, sacrifice, and the quiet miracle that unfolded beneath the snow. Montana in late January is not a place for the weak-hearted. The sky hangs low, a sheet of steel gray, and the wind howls down from the Bitterroot Mountains like a living thing. Snow falls not in soft flakes but in stinging shards, carried sideways by gusts that snap tree limbs like twigs. That night, the town of Darby lay silent under 3 feet of powder, its narrow roads buried and the pine forests ghostly white. Walter Briggs, a 68-year-old widower with a face carved by years of weather and solitude, stood by the single-pane window of his off-grid cabin at the edge of the Bitterroot National Forest. Tall and wiry, with silver hair always tucked beneath a wool cap, and eyes the color of winter skies, Walter had once been a master carpenter known for the kind of woodwork that whispered of patience and pride. But since the loss of his wife Clara and their only son to a drunk driving accident 12 winters ago, he had spoken to few and trusted fewer. He lived simply now off the land and off the grid, in a cabin he built with his own hands, heating it with pine logs and feeding himself with what he trapped or grew. The townspeople called him the Ghost of Bitterroot, a man of few words who appeared only when necessity dragged him to town. That night, as Walter sipped bitter coffee and fed another log into the stove, a sound broke through the storm. At first, he dismissed it a trick of the wind, perhaps, but then it came again. A sharp, high-pitched whine, almost a cry. Not human, not quite animal, but full of something unmistakably alive. Walter set down his mug and stepped outside, the snow up to his knees, the cold slicing through his coat. He stood still, listening. There it was, again a desperate whimper, barely audible above the gale. He grabbed his flashlight, pulled on his snowshoes, and followed the sound into the woods. It took him nearly 20 minutes of trudging through snowdrifts and ducking frozen branches to find the source. There, at the base of a drooping pine, he saw her. A yellow Labrador, barely more than a skeleton, chained tightly to the tree trunk. Her ribs jutted through a patchy coat matted with ice and mud. Around her were 6 tiny puppies, curled together for warmth, crying in thin, reedy tones. One had its eyes half shut and trembled uncontrollably. The mother no collar, no tags looked up at Walter but didn't move, her eyes dull but still holding something stubborn, something maternal. She'd scraped a shallow nest in the snow beneath her, using her own body to shield the pups from the cold. Walter's breath caught. He dropped to his knees, brushing snow from the smallest puppy. The mother let out a soft growl, not of threat but of pain and exhaustion. Walter, whose heart hadn't stirred in years, felt something shift inside him. These animals had been left to die, and yet, here she was, still trying. Without thinking further, he unhooked the chain, bundled the pups into the folds of his coat, and lifted the mother into his arms. She was lighter than she should have been. He didn't speak, only whispered, "Come on, girl," as he turned back through the blizzard, the storm now roaring louder than before. By the time Walter reached his cabin, his fingers had gone numb, and the puppies were barely moving. He laid them gently in a woven basket beside the stove, filling it with old towels. The mother he placed on a wool blanket, then stoked the fire until the room glowed red and gold. As warmth crept back into the space, the puppies began to whimper, more urgently alive, but just barely. The mother's breathing was shallow, her eyes fluttering shut. Walter opened a can of sardines, the only meat he had, and held one to her mouth. She licked it slowly, then nudged it toward the pups with her nose. He watched them as they fed weakly, desperately, and something hot rose in his chest. He had once built cribs, carved rocking chairs for his son, read bedtime stories in a voice just like this storm, low and fierce. And yet, for years, silence had been his only companion. But now, in the flickering warmth of his wood stove, surrounded by a family that was not his, the silence finally cracked. He would later name the mother Daisy, though that name had not yet come to him. For now, she was simply Girl. The pups would each get names too, in time, though Walter didn't know it yet. What he did know, standing there with snow melting off his boots and a strange tightness in his throat, was this: they weren't going to die, not tonight. The morning after the storm broke was dim and gray, the sky a dull sheet pressed low over the pine trees of Bitterroot Forest. Snowdrifts climbed high against the side of Walter's cabin, their ridges smooth and untouched. Inside, the warmth from the wood stove pulsed gently through the air, a small sanctuary carved out against the endless cold. The mother dog, now named Daisy, lay curled on an old quilt, her breathing shallow but even. Her hind leg was badly swollen, matted with dried blood and clumps of black fur that had frozen and split in the cold. Her ribs stuck out like ridges under skin stretched too thin. Walter crouched next to her with quiet hands, stroking gently behind her ears. The puppies, 6 in all, had made it through the night barely. Their small bodies trembled under thick layers of old flannel. One, a pale cream pup with a scar-like marking across his forehead, hadn't opened his eyes at all. He lay apart from the others, his breathing soft, twitching now and then like he was chasing something in his dreams. Walter stood slowly, joints creaking like old floorboards. He crossed the cabin to a rotary phone hanging near the pantry and dialed a number from memory he hadn't called in over 10 years. On the third ring, a familiar voice answered. Nora Fields. Nora, Walter said, his voice low and unsure. It's Walter. I need your help. There was a pause, then warmly, I'll bring what I can. Be there by noon. Nora Fields arrived not long after, bundled in a heavy red parka that made her look broader than her slight frame. She was in her early 70s now, her silver-gray hair braided down her back, and though she moved carefully on the snowy path, her eyes still sparkled with the no-nonsense fire of the small-town girl who used to outrun every boy in school. Once a veterinarian in Derby before retiring 5 years ago, Nora had kept her supplies and her instincts intact. Inside the cabin, she moved immediately into action. With calm fingers, she examined Daisy's wound, disinfected it, and began cleaning the puppies one by one. Walter hovered nearby, uncomfortable and silent. Her legs infected, Nora muttered, packing antibiotic salve into the wound. Old barbed wire maybe. Someone left her out there too long. She looked up at Walter. And these pups have severe hypothermia. This one, she pointed to the pale pup. He may be blind. Could be frostbite in the eyes. Walter swallowed. Is he in pain? Not now, but survival's not guaranteed. You should prepare for that. He looked at Daisy, who lifted her head slightly at the sound of his voice. Her eyes met his brown, deep, weary, but they didn't waver. She was still fighting. Walter nodded once, more to himself than to Nora. Then I won't give up either. Nora softened. You never did know how to let go, she said, not unkindly. You still sanding your own floorboards? Built a feeding chair last spring. For who? Walter didn't answer. They worked in silence for a while. Nora warmed goat's milk on the stove and fed each puppy with a dropper. She administered subcutaneous fluids to the smallest one. Daisy licked his ear afterward, eyes never leaving him. You always had a way with the broken things, Nora said gently as she folded gauze. Still do. Walter busied himself refilling the firewood bin, but he paused. I used to think I could fix anything. Wood doesn't cry in the night, doesn't bleed. You're not just patching wood now, Walter. He didn't respond, but his shoulders sagged slightly. By late afternoon, the puppies were nestled together on a fresh towel bed, and Daisy had been given pain meds and a proper nameplate. Nora carved Daisy into a small piece of pine. Walter had sanded smooth. She hung it above the basket. Walter watched her from across the room as she packed her supplies. You think they'll make it? Nora hesitated, hand on the doorknob. Some will, she said quietly, and some won't, but it won't be for lack of trying. She turned to go, then looked back. You're not alone out here, Walter. Not anymore. The door closed with a soft click, swallowed quickly by the snow. That night, the wind outside had calmed, but inside the cabin, it was Daisy's shallow breaths and the twitching paws of her pups that filled the room. Walter sat beside the stove, staring at the basket. In those 6 tiny lives lay something fragile, terrifying, and strangely sacred. A second chance he hadn't asked for, but couldn't turn away from. And for the first time in 12 years, he didn't sleep in his bed. He slept beside the fire, wrapped in an old quilt, with Daisy no more than a breath away. The wind had softened by the 3rd night. The forest outside Walter's cabin now lay in stillness, draped in a hush so complete it felt sacred. The towering pines stood heavy with snow, their limbs sagging under the weight like tired sentinels. Inside, warmth emanated from the old cast-iron stove, where embers crackled softly, casting a deep orange glow across the floorboards Walter had once laid with his son. Daisy had not moved much since Nora's visit. She rarely barked or whimpered, but her eyes followed every movement of Walter's hands. She'd eaten a few bites the day Nora was there, but refused anything since. Walter had tried coaxing her with broth and crumbled beef jerky, even slicing up a leftover pork chop from the freezer. But each time she nudged the food toward the pups or simply ignored it, her gaunt frame curled tightly around the sleeping bundles like a protective crescent moon. Walter sat in his armchair, worn leather cracked at the edges, staring at her. A small ceramic bowl sat beside him, filled with the stew he had planned to share with Daisy Rabbit and root vegetables, slow-cooked with the last of his winter spices. The smell filled the cabin, earthy and comforting, but Daisy didn't stir. Something gnawed at him. The way she tucked her paws over the smallest pup, the one he'd begun calling Echo. For the faintest breath it still took reminded him of Clara. His wife had done the same when their boy, Matthew, came home from school crying over a broken bike or a lost race. She'd fold herself around him like a harbor against the world. And he had watched, grateful and stupid, never imagining she could be taken. Walter stood and walked to the fire, stirring it with an iron poker, letting the memories come. No, we had stopped resisting days ago. The fire hissed, wood popping like muted gunshots. He closed his eyes. He saw Clara's silhouette in the morning light, brushing snow from the porch. He saw Matthew carving his name into the old oak outside. He saw the empty passenger seat, the call from the sheriff, the funeral on a Sunday that never ended. A sound brought him back, a soft whine. Walter turned. Daisy had pulled herself upright, trembling. Her paws buckled slightly, but she crawled forward on her belly, dragging her weakened body closer to him. She rested her chin on his knee, the movement slow and deliberate. Her breathing was ragged. Walter reached down, touched the top of her head, and felt the jut of bone beneath thin fur. "Why won't you eat, girl?" he whispered. "You've done enough." Daisy didn't move, but her eyes, dark, unflinching, met his. They held nothing of fear, only a weary determination. Walter felt his throat tighten, the edges of long-buried grief pulling at the seams. She was dying to let them live. And in that moment, it wasn't Daisy on the floor and Walter in the chair. It was two souls hollowed by loss, finding shape again through each other. He slid off the chair and sat cross-legged on the floor beside her. The pups stirred in their basket behind them. Walter leaned forward, placed his palm gently on Daisy's paw, then lowered his forehead to hers. His voice was barely a breath. "You're not alone now. I won't let you carry this by yourself." Tears came not from the eyes, but from a deeper place, a place that hadn't bled in 15 years. They came silent and warm, dripping into Daisy's fur. And as if she understood, Daisy raised her head slightly and gave his hand one slow lick. It was not affection, it was communion. They stayed like that until the fire dimmed into coals and the moon slid behind clouds. The snow had softened to slush by the end of February, leaving the pine-blanketed landscape dripping with the slow melt of approaching spring. Outside Walter's cabin, patches of earth had begun to reappear dark and soaked, while the icicles hanging from the eaves wept under the pale morning sun. The cabin's wooden walls, weathered by storm after storm, now held something new within: life, fragile and persistent. The puppies had grown. Their eyes were fully open, their limbs sturdier, and their squeaks of hunger had become tiny yips of impatience. Daisy watched them constantly, but her steps were more careful now, her body still weak from malnourishment. Among her 6 pups, one stood apart not for size or coat, but for the way he moved. Or rather, didn't. Walter had first noticed it when the others began to wobble onto their paws and tumble clumsily toward their mother. All except the smallest, the light brown pup with bright eyes and an eager bark. He tried, over and over, to lift his hind legs, but they dragged uselessly behind him. His spirit was there, a flame of determination, but his back half refused to obey. Walter had named him Scout, for the way he always tried to be first to the bowl, first to crawl across the floor, first to sniff the outside air. He was a fighter just like Daisy. Walter told Nora during her next visit. She arrived on a Sunday, wearing her patched green coat, her breath fogging in the cold as she unpacked her bag. After a thorough check, she gently broke the news. "It's spinal, Walter. Might be a birth defect or from the cold. But this little guy, he won't walk. Not without pain. I know you care. But this isn't a life I'd wish on any dog." Walter looked at her, face unmoving. "He's not just a dog. He's mine now, and he wants to live." Nora studied him for a long moment, then sighed, handing him a small container of pain medication and instructions. "Then we help him live." That night, Walter rummaged through the far side of the cabine's old workshop. Covered in dust and memories, it smelled of cedar, oil, and time. He found a drawer of miniature wheels once meant for toy carts and sleds, a few slender planks, old leather straps. He stayed up past midnight, measuring Scout carefully, sanding down tiny slats, fitting straps like a tailor fits a suit. By sunrise, a prototype sat beside the basket, a crude but functional wheelchair for a 4-pound pup. When Walter fastened Scout into it and gently set him down, the pup froze confused at first. Then his front legs pushed forward, and the tiny wheels creaked. He wobbled, he paused, then he moved. Daisy barked softly. The other pups turned. And Scout, rolling awkwardly across the floor, let out a bark so sharp and joyful that Walter chuckled out loud an unfamiliar sound in the cabin. The story could have ended there, in quiet victory, but it didn't. One morning, Nora returned with a camera. "Just a few photos," she said. "For the clinic's newsletter, people should know what you've done." Walter frowned but allowed it. She took pictures of Daisy and her pups, Scout and his wheels, Walter in the background sanding wood. A week later, the story went online. A cabin in the woods, a dog named Daisy, and the man who wouldn't give up. It was meant for a few local readers, but within days, the post had gone viral. Emails poured in. Letters arrived in crumpled envelopes with ink-stained handwriting, donations, offers to adopt the other pups. Some messages were simple. "Thank you for this hope." Others longer, stories of lost children, empty homes, silent nights broken only by grief. People who had lost everything wrote to say, Daisy saved them. Walter, overwhelmed, began letting the neighborhood children visit. He hadn't heard laughter in years, but now it filled the cabin like sunlight through dust. Scout would zip between their boots, barking. The kids would bring treats, draw pictures of Daisy, and listen wide-eyed as Walter, who had once spoken to no one, told them about each pup's personality, as if they were fairy tale heroes. One girl, 9-year-old Emily Caldwell, stood out. She was slight and shy, with strawberry blonde hair and a scar across her chin from a bike accident. Her mother had passed the year before, and since then, Emily hadn't spoken a word in school. But with Daisy, she whispered. With Scout, she laughed. Walter watched her from the porch one day, as she pushed Scout gently in his wheels. Her face held a gentleness he hadn't seen in a long time. When she turned to him, her eyes said thank you. That night, as Walter sat beside the fire with Daisy at his feet, he realized something. He had rebuilt tables, doors, rocking chairs, but none of them had meant as much as this rolling cart, a rescued dog, a quiet girl smiling again. He looked at the flickering fire, then at the photos pinned to his fridge, Daisy and her pups, Scout in motion, Emily giggling. For years his world had ended at the tree line. But now it was growing, stretching, coming back to life. By the time March crept into the Bitterroot Valley, the snow had begun to recede in quiet surrender. The once immovable drifts shrank under the kiss of midday sun. leaving trails of cold mud and tufts of pine needles in their wake. The forest change Tuhat was silent, and white now stirred with birdsong and the distant echo of melting ice slipping from branches. Walter's cabin, tucked against the slope like a forgotten relic, no longer looked so lonely. Inside, life moved with rhythm. The puppies, now 10 weeks old, tumbled over one another with boundless energy, barking at shadows and nipping ears in mock battle. They had grown into sturdy little bodies with sharp teeth, slick coats, and endless curiosity. Walter had given each a name, not out of necessity, but because each had grown a personality too strong to ignore. Copper, the bold leader; Lily, the quiet shadow; Buck, the relentless tugger of socks; Maple, with ears too big for her head; and Tilly, who liked to sleep under Walter's rocker. And then there was Scout. Scout, in his polished pine wheelchair version, 3, by now zipped from room to room, an unstoppable blur of joy. His legs may not have worked, but his spirit had never once faltered. Walter had reinforced the wheels with rubber salvaged from an old garden hose and added leather straps so Scout could climb the porch ramp with ease. Daisy watched him now without worry, only pride. Daisy had transformed too. Her ribs no longer jutted, her coat had softened into a golden sheen, and the haunted glaze in her eyes had faded into calm trust. She no longer flinched at raised voices or sudden movement. Instead, she slept curled in the center of the living room rug, paws twitching in dreams, tail sometimes wagging even in sleep. Walter had taken to leaving the door open in the afternoons, letting the spring air curl around the cabin. Children still visited. Emily came often, now with a hand-drawn notebook filled with Scout's adventures, which she narrated in a quiet voice, more confident with every visit. She had begun speaking in school again. Her father had written in a note last week. "Scout gave me my daughter back," it read. Walter kept the note in a drawer with Clara's last photograph and a tiny carved pine paw print labeled Daisy's First Day. The adoptions happened slowly, one by one. First went Buck and Tilly, taken by a retired couple named James and Bonnie Hargrove, who lived in a farmhouse just outside Derby. They were warm, soft-spoken people, James with a bald head and loud laugh, Bonnie with silver curls and arms that always smelled of lavender soap. Maple and Copper followed next, claimed by a young teacher named Vanessa Groves and her partner Kyle, who promised updates and birthday parties for the pups. Lily was adopted by a college student who'd lost her emotional support dog the year before. Her name was Reagan, and she cried when Daisy licked her hand goodbye. Only Scout and Daisy remained. Scout's turn came on a Saturday, beneath a sky so blue it made the mountains sharper. A couple from Missoula had driven 2 hours to meet him, Aiden and Melissa Park, in their late 30s. No kids, both smiling nervously as they stepped from their SUV. Aiden, a lanky man with soft brown eyes and a gentle stutter, crouched and opened his arms without hesitation. Scout barreled toward him. Melissa, petite and freckled with wild curly hair, looked toward Walter with tearful eyes. He's perfect," she whispered. They promised daily walks, vet visits, updates. Walter believed them. The hardest part wasn't letting go, it was watching Daisy watch Scout's departure. She followed the pup to the door, sniffed the wheels one last time, and gave a low, quiet whine. Scout licked her muzzle, barked once, and rolled into the sunlight. Daisy didn't move. Only after the car drove away did she return to Walter's side and sit beside his chair in the fading light. The days after were slower. The house felt larger, quieter. Walter cooked less. The fire burned slower. But Daisy stayed close, often laying her head on his foot, or watching birds flutter just outside the window. Then, one evening near the end of March, Walter stepped outside as the sun slipped behind the trees. The light fell in long gold stripes across the yard, where tiny wildflowers had begun to appear. Daisy followed him, then trotted forward into the yard. For the first time, she barked not at danger, not at fear, but simply because she could. She ran in loops, tail high, paws thumping the softened earth. Walter laughed, low and unguarded. He stepped onto the porch and saw them. Dozens of paw prints scattered across the muddy yard, weaving, crossing, layered like a painting scout's small wheels, Buck's broad strides, Lily's featherlight steps. He closed his eyes. For so long, winter had lived in him, not the season, but the stillness, the hollow. But now, watching Daisy run beneath a sky no longer gray, feeling the echo of laughter and the memory of 6 tiny lives that had passed through his hands, Walter felt something shift, a thaw. And for the first time in 15 years, he whispered aloud, not to the woods, not to the wind, but to the life still beside him. "We made it out, girl. We're home." Sometimes the ones who need saving end up saving us. In the silence of snow and the howl of winter, one dog's quiet courage melted a man's frozen grief and sparked hope across a town. Daisy didn't just survive, she helped others find the strength to keep going, one paw print at a time. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share this with someone who needs a little light in their own winter. And before you go, drop us a comment and let us know, where in the world are you listening from? We'd love to hear your story too.